Angels Care Home Health, serving Hayes and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
I love the nurses that come and see me.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible.
Since I learned about Angel Care, I would recommend them to anybody.
Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.
Eagle Community Television presents Community Connection with your host, Mike Cooper.
Hello and welcome again to Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks for watching. Thanks as always to the producer and editor of our series, Jeff DeRoll. We're just outside of Walker, Kansas at the Walker Army Airfield site, a location that historian Steve Arthur knows about. And today we're going to talk about that. Steve Arthur is not only historian, but also director of the Ellis Public Library. So, Steve, let's start there if we could. Summer activities at the Ellis Public Library. What do you got going on?
Well, we just finished up our rocketry program. We had a 2-day program where we teach kids how to build rockets. We'll have a magic show, and the makerspace is just going as usual.
Now, you're going to launch those rockets at some point?
Some of the kids will. The ones that were in 4-H will probably launch their own rockets, but the rest of them I don't ever know.
Now you've got the makerspace in place.
Right, and we actually just purchased a new 3D printer. It'll double our capabilities, maybe get more kids interested in 3D printing, and they'll be able to 3D print fidget spinners, which is a big thing right now.
I've heard that's the latest fad now.
Yeah.
Wow. So you can actually do that on a 3D printer.
Correct. All you have to do is download the STL file and start printing.
Oh my goodness, they're going to be beating down your doors, I think, to be able to do that, Steve. Plus a lot of other activities as usual at the Ellis Public Library. When are you open?
We are open Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays from 10 until 6. Tuesdays 10 until 8 and Saturdays 10 until 2.
And you can visit the Ellis Public Library with Director Steve Arthur. The official name of the facility, the Walker Army Airfield. There is another airfield that has a similar name in a different state, right, Steve?
Correct. It's called Walker Air Force Base. It was also a B-29 base after the war, but it's in Clovis, New Mexico.
How did you get interested in the airfield and its history, Steve?
It began with a request from the Forsyth Library to build a model of the air base. The official Air Force history of Walker Field was only a paragraph long, so I had to do a lot of digging. It took me 3.5 years to just scratch the surface.
That model, is that still available for people to see at Forsyth?
Right now it's been disassembled and it's being held by the Ellis County Historical Society in storage. I took the aircraft and the buildings home with me to do a restoration project on it.
The airfield itself, can you give us some of the perimeters, like physical size, when it was in operation and such?
As far as physical size, I can't recall the exact acreage, but there's 10,000 feet worth of runway out there. At its high point, there was 5,000 people working on Walker. The housing area towards the end of the war became its own municipality, and they actually elected a mayor who was a PFC.
The community of Walker, Kansas, was it before or after or during the air base when that community came into being?
It was during. It was already in existence. They just called it Walker Army Airfield because of its proximity to Walker. Actually, initially when the air base opened, all the mail came through Victoria.
And the facility itself was complete then at Walker Airfield?
Yes and no. When they began working on Walker in 1942. That was when they scouted out the area. They began construction early in 43 and they were done in less than 70 days. This is one of the coolest things about Walker. It's a great microcosm as far as mobilization during the war years. The only difference is that people assume that the hangars were there, the buildings were there. No. The runway was there. What they did was they put everyone in tents. They carried out maintenance on the flight line. So for those guys that were here initially in the winter, it was a very miserable experience.
Wow, 70 days though when
Yeah.
this was done. So it was a real mobilization effort, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
What was the determining factor for putting the air base where they did, Steve?
Mostly because Kansas was a hot spot for aviation. The weather was great for flying, but for primarily what the B-29s was because of its proximity to the Boeing facility in Wichita.
And this was strictly a B-29 base?
This
then?
was strictly a B-29 base. There were 4 of them in Kansas: Pratt, Great Bend, Salina, and here.
And were they constructed then at the Boeing plant in Wichita and then
Some of
moved
them
here?
came from Wichita. Some of them came from Renton, Washington, the Boeing plant there, and a few of them came from the Bell plant in Georgia.
So they would be brought here and then the pilots would be trained.
Correct. The thing about the B-29 is the B-29 was the only aircraft that there were no prototypes. So all the bugs that came with the new design were worked out by these guys here. That's why when you look at the history of Walker, there were quite a few crashes and a lot of fatalities. In fact, one of the B-29s exploded pretty much right over us, where we're located, and is scattered across the Sweetwater Ranch north of here.
Wow, that's quite a story in itself. The pilots that were trained then, were they shipped from all over the United States to here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They came from every corner of the United States. That's one of the interesting things about it is that, you know, some of these guys grew up in New York City, you know, and they came out here and just couldn't believe it.
Now, talking about this area was mainly farmland at the time, right? How did the local population relate to this new facility?
Some people liked it. Some people really hated it. Those of the people who owned farms out here and lost them as a result of the building of the air base, they have a lot of bad feelings towards the air base. But for those who worked out here, it was wonderful. They loved it.
And there was a relationship, I guess, between the landowners, the farmers who were here, even some of the people in the area with the community.
Oh, absolutely.
And then the Walker community relating to other parts of the population?
Walker during the war years pretty much became the cultural hub of the county, or in the surrounding counties, as a matter of fact. I mean, one of my predecessors from the Ellis Library, when she was a young girl, on Friday nights they would load them up on a bus from Ellis and ship them out here to dance with the guys at the USO Club. You know, they had stuff going on out here all the time. People would come out here just to go to the movies because they had air conditioning.
Oh.
They had beauty contests, giant parties.
It sounds like a real total community almost.
It was. You know, at its high point, there was 5,000 people out here. The housing area became its own municipality towards the end of the war, and they elected a PFC as the mayor.
So they had housing, they had the facility for training, they had repair facilities, I would assume.
Yes.
And also part of it was the testing of the B-29s, and that meant not only flying but also ammunition and other parts of it.
Right. There were gunnery ranges and bombing ranges located all around us. The closest one was a bombing range, was located in Trego County. Another one was a gunnery range that's located down where Cheyenne Bottoms is. And of course where Smoky Hill, what the heck is the name of that place? It's the gunnery range by Salina. I mean, the B-29s did fly around here, but a lot of them, since they were a long-range aircraft, they frequently flew to places like Cuba, or they would make a long square around the United States and come back.
Why the B-29?
The B-29, as far as what?
The incorporation into the overall ramp up to World War II.
Well, the B-29 was a very long-range bomber. And the reason that it was pushed into production was because Chiang Kai-shek was wanting the Roosevelt administration to do something about the Japanese in mainland China. And the B-29 was their best option. So what they did was they flew missions out of India and into China, and eventually they ended up in the Pacific, you know, flying out of places like Guam and Tinian and Saipan. So that's one of the reasons why the B-29 was not developed like most aircraft. It was just shoved into production because there was this pressure to get them into combat.
Did it replace an aircraft, or did it become a part of the overall aircraft?
It didn't replace aircraft, but it became a longer air arm. So that they had the distance that a B-17 could not reach. I mean, they could fly from relatively safe locations like Tinian and Saipan and Guam to the Japanese mainland, where a B-17 could not do that.
So it was a long-range bomber as opposed to the B-17, which was more of a short-range.
Right. It was a long-range bomber, and it had an incredible ceiling, meaning that they could fly considerably high. In fact, some of the guys told me when they first started bombing with it, they had ran into something that nobody really knew about, the jet stream. And so they had situations where they would be flying and they would actually stop their forward momentum because they were flying against the jet stream.
An amazing story of the B-29. Now, there were a couple, you had referenced this at one time, Steve, about a couple of the B-29s that have been refurbished, that have been actually put in as showpieces now, is that right?
Yeah, one of them is Fifi, which belongs to the Commemorative Air Force out of Texas. Fifi's been around for a long time. And then the most recent one is Doc, which was just restored at Wichita and brought back to flight status within the last year. Doc was, I'm not sure where Fifi came from, but Doc was actually salvaged from, I think, China Lake in California. They were using it as a target. And so a gentleman from California rescued her and brought her back here, got Boeing involved in it, and they brought her back to flight status.
You even tried to become a part of that restoration, I understand.
I did. When they initially brought Doc back, I tried to become part of the restoration project. I was thanked and told no.
Yeah, thanks, but no thanks, was the way it went apparently. When was the operation of the Walker Army Airfield? What years are we talking about?
And in 1942, they scouted out the area. They began construction in 43. 70 days later, operational airfield. It continued right up until the end of the war in 1945. They used Walker as a clearinghouse for the war-weary B-29, so they brought a lot of them back from the Pacific. And some of them were sent to places like Louisiana, to Barksdale Air Force, what is now Barksdale Air Force Base, to continue as bombers. And the rest of them were probably sent to Arizona to the boneyard.
In the discussion of the numbers, you said about 5,000 people. Soldiers and civilians, was there a combination of people on the airfield?
There was. I mean, without the civilian population around here, Walker could not have functioned. I mean, the civilians were an integral part in the daily operations of Walker. All facilities had a civilian contingent to it.
We are, of course, on the edges of the Walker Army Airfield because it is now private land. What are we seeing here in the background, as far as you can tell, since we're not able to actually get on the property itself?
The one building in the foreground is one of the was one of the remaining hangars. There's only one other extant hangar, and then the tall structure in the background was the base water tower.
And there are other parts of the air base that are still standing, or at least even though they're in ruins?
Most of the foundations are still extant for the barracks and things like that, and the warehouses. There's a small building towards the south end of the field that I believe was one of the fire stations that's still extant, and of course the ammo bunker.
And you also mentioned that there was a big dirt mound which was used as part of the gunnery range.
Right. It was where they bore sighted the 50 calibers on the B-29s. So they would taxi the B-29 out there in front of the target, and then they would blast away at the target that way they could see if all their rounds were converging to a point.
And there is also, and probably one of the reasons, even though it is private land, and one of the reasons that restricted access is because of that very thing, that there's a lot of stuff still left out there.
Oh yes, at the end of the war, I inquired about this, and one of the veterans told me that they did not want to flood the market with all this military surplus. So what they did was they did the same thing that Patton did with his army before he left for North Africa. They buried it. They buried an entire army in the desert of California. So what they did here was the exact same thing. They dug these gigantic trenches, drove in stuff, piled it in, they covered it with tar paper, and then they would start putting layers of dirt, and then they sprinkled that with live ordnance to discourage people from coming out there and digging it back up.
Wow. And there could be everything that...
From airplane parts to Jeeps.
And typewriters as well?
Typewriters and rifles, and yes.
You've had a rather unique opportunity as a historian here for the Walker Army Airfield to visit with some of the people who were here, some of the groups that had formed that are still in contact. We're going to talk about that too, if you're willing to do that. Steve Arthur is our community connection.
Angels Care Home Health, serving Hayes and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
My Angel Care physical therapist taught me how to do exercises safely.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible.
It gives us independence in our home.
Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.
Welcome back to our Community Connection. We're just outside of Walker, Kansas, with historian Steve Arthur, director of the Ellis Public Library, as we talk about the Walker Army Airfield and some of the people who were associated with that. A couple of names come to mind immediately in Hayes. As I told you earlier, Steve, the only reference I had to Walker previously was that plaque at the Hayes Public Library there on the Main Street location, which kind of gives a brief history of Walker.
Right. Yeah, and when I was doing my research on Walker, that's when I ran into Ray Humans and Larry Dryden. And then there was another gentleman, I can't recall his name anymore, that were spearheading the plaque project.
Now, what about the groups? Were there actual organizations and groups that were formed from people who were at Walker in that experience?
Yeah, every bomb group has its own bomb group association. During the time when I was doing my research, that's how I got to know a lot of these guys. There was a lady in Georgia, her name was Sally Ann Wagner, she's still around. I still talk to her. She started it was a web page, it was more of a message board. It was called Sally Ann's Boys, and it was all these guys that were B-29s. Not just Walker, but every B-29 group that was in existence. I stumbled onto that page. I started poking around. One of the guys kind of took me in under his wing. His name was Don Murray. He was from Powhatan, Virginia. Initially, he was from Brooklyn, New York. He came out here with one of the first bomb groups with the 330th. They sent him to Pratt initially. They didn't have a slot for him there, so they sent him to Walker. He arrived here in the middle of the night. The next morning, he walked out and thought he'd fallen off the face of the earth.
Looked around, and there was another guy.
There was nothing out there.
Oh my. Now, these groups that you connected with, you've actually attended some of their meetings.
I attended some of their meetings. They all became sort of like adoptive fathers. I had 25 of them that just was constantly worrying about what I was, if I had the right information, you know. They would make sure I had these things, you know. They would get me in contact with the right people, you know. If they couldn't answer it, they would find somebody that would.
So these are the original sources then?
These were the original sources. There were 3 bomb groups, or there are actually 4. But the first 3 was the 462nd, the 330th, and the 500.
Now, do they still meet regularly?
Most of them have passed away. The associations are still in existence, but a lot of them are attended by the children of these guys.
And you have had an opportunity to go to some of these meetings?
I have.
And heard the stories?
And heard the stories, and some of them even came to me.
Tell me some of the stories, would you?
Well, let's see. I'm trying. Okay, Lee Florence was one of the guys I got to know, and he was telling me that when they got ready to leave, the commander of the 462nd wanted to make sure he had all the amenities of home with him, and so when they loaded up their planes, they packed the Bombay with bathtubs, things like this, you know, because, and so they were having a hard time, you know, taking the things that they needed to take with them. Paul Myers was another guy from the 462nd. They decided to, when they left, that they were going to say goodbye in style to Hayes. And so as they were flying over Hayes, they were dropping rolls of toilet paper out the Bombays and TPing Hayes. He said that they really regretted that when they got to India.
Those stories are coming from the original sources then, and are you able to say with some authority, I guess, that these are true stories?
Oh, I have no doubt that they're not true stories.
Why would they not be?
Right. You even peripherally, you can look, you know. I was in the military, and I know what the military is like, and I know what the military does to communities too, you know, as far as, you know, the pranks and things like that. So yeah, I don't have any doubts.
Tell me about your service.
Oh, I served in the 1980s, and I was in the military police.
One of those bomber groups that you were talking about, when was the last time you met with them?
Gosh, the last time it's probably been 10 years, 15 years maybe, that I've talked to him. One of my main contacts, his name was Bob Copeland, or Bill Copeland. He was one of my big contacts with the 500 bomb group, and I haven't heard from him since. Sally Ann I hear from once a year.
So that website is still active then?
Yeah, actually it's called b29.org now. Someone else, I think one of the other guys that was the son of one of the 330th guys took over that web page for Sally Ann, and he keeps it up and puts a lot of photographs and things like that on there.
I'm going to say a tremendous amount of very important history during this time of the ramp up as the United States became a full-fledged partner in the war against the German and Japanese powers.
Yeah, that was one of the things that people don't. There's a legend around here about the German cave, you know. When I first started inquiring about that, I asked the B-29 guys, and I said, "Did you ever hear about this?" "Oh yeah, we heard about it," you know. Okay, so in 1943, when Walker was active, we're still a year away from the invasion of Europe. So it stood to reason that maybe there were spies out here because they weren't exact, even though the B-29 was supposed to be a secret, it really wasn't. I mean, if you go back in one of the Hayes papers, when they rolled out the B-29 at Wichita, some relative that had a connection to Hayes was telling them, you know, they flew the B-29 that day, at what level it flew and how long they had it in the air. You know, so much for operational security.
Yeah, type of information an enemy agent would love to.
Exactly,
have their
and
hands
so
on.
it stood to reason if you live in a county that is predominantly German, you would blend in okay, and so allegedly the caves were here within sight of the air base, and so, you know, in 1943 it was quite feasible that, or possible, somebody was watching the B-29s, because at that time it would have definitely turned the tide in Europe.
And of course, you've heard the stories about the German prisoners of war that were housed in this area.
Right, yes.
Some of whom at the what is now the Agricultural Experiment Station, and other even farmhouses where some of the young soldiers were housed or worked on some of these local farms.
Right, right.
Tell me about a couple of more stories that you recall from those days of visiting with those bomber groups.
Most of them, I mean, as far as, there was some that were very enterprising. Prior to them leaving for India, you know, in one of the squadrons got a hold of a slot machine. And so they set up a casino in their barracks. And so all the proceeds from their casino paid for materials when they reached Saipan. There was a lot of farmers that were pulling their daughters off of the air base, you know, because they would be out partying with the boys all night.
Entrepreneurship to an nth degree, I think.
Exactly.
That is amazing. And of course, I'm sure that during your time of visiting at these bomber groups, you probably heard some tragic stories.
Very
as well.
tragic stories. I mean, like I said, the plane was not, it was not a finished product. It wasn't a finished product during the duration of the war. Bill Copeland that I mentioned, his uncle Robert died during the war. They had a plane. In fact, Aviation History wrote an article about Robert's plane. It was called St. Bernard. And the reason they named it St. Bernard was when they had a B-29 that had taken a lot of hits and was lagging behind the rest of the group. Robert's plane would orbit and stay with it until they got close enough that they could get back, or they could ditch and they could be rescued right away.
Wow.
Towards the end of the war, the Japanese were desperate. And so what they did was they put young kids in these planes. They teach them to fly it, but they never teach them to land it. And so the purpose of these guys was to fly up, meet the formations, and ram their planes into the B-29s. And Robert's plane was one of those that was rammed. And he did not survive. The crew did not survive, you know. And the plane had crashed outside of Osaka near a POW camp. And there was a Capuchin priest that was there, petitioned the camp commander to go out and retrieve the bodies of the airmen to bury them. And after about 4 or 5 days, the commander finally said, okay, go get them. One of the guys that I knew, his name was Ray Halloran. He was a bombardier. Ray's story was one that really tore me up because he was abused. I mean, people don't understand that the Japanese had considered all airmen war criminals. Chances are, if you were captured by the Japanese, you were summarily executed at the spot that they found you. Or you were taken back, put through a military tribunal, forced to sign documents that were not translated for you, and essentially it was an admission that you were a war criminal. They'd take you out and shoot you. Ray's plane had been rammed. He survived. He was captured. and they tossed him in a cell at Omari Prison. He waited for them to come get him to kill him. And one day they came and got him. He thought, this is it. They beat him up. They stripped him of his clothes. They marched him through the streets of Osaka, put him in a cage at the Osaka Zoo, and they had the residents of Osaka parade past him to demonstrate that the Americans were not invincible.
Amazing stories.
It was really hard to take, because the whole time Ray is reliving this for me, you could see the pain in his eyes, you know.
Still with it, obviously.
And I kept stopping and I go, Ray, you don't have to tell me this. No, I have to tell you this.
Are you still doing historical work?
Not
on
so
Walker?
much about Walker anymore. My sights have changed on the Cold War, so now I'm interested in the missile bases that were dotted around Kansas.
Those silos,
Yeah.
and some of the nuclear silos
Yeah.
that...
Particularly the Atlas sites. Like there was an Atlas site there located at Wilson. There's one up by Osborne. That was part of the Salina chain. But the Holy Grail for me is one that is located north of Topeka. It's a different type of silo that was designed where the Atlas laid down in the silo and would come up.
Oh.
There would be sliding doors, and it would come up. And
As
they would
opposed
launch
to
it.
standing straight
there
up.
constantly and just be lifted up.
Wow. Well, we'll be expecting a phone call once the research is complete, because that is another fascinating story of our history.
This is what I love about Kansas, is that Kansas, I was reminded of this last night. I inherited some aviation quarterly books from somebody, and I was reading through. Kansas has got an incredibly rich aviation history, and not just Wichita, but the entire state does.
We'll be talking in future periods of time, Steve. Steve Arthur, director of the Ellis Public Library. And by the way, we should mention our producer and editor, Jeff Durall, had that Social Security card of his grandfather that was from the Walker Air Base when he served out here. So
Yeah, some of the things, I actually have ID badges. Everyone was issued an ID badge. Essentially, it was just like those buttons, you know, you get with the button makers. And so if you were a B-29 crewman, you had a red button with your photograph on it. If you were a civilian employee, it was a powder blue one. So each one was color-coded for whatever area that you worked in on the air base.
thank you for your work and your research,
Well, thank
Steve.
you.
It's fascinating. The director of the Ellis Public Library, historian for the Walker Army Airfield, Steve Arthur, our community connection.
Angels Care Home Health, serving Hayes and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
My Angel Care physical therapist taught me how to do exercises safely.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible.
It gives us independence in our home.
Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.